Welcome to this Violence and Harassment in the Workplace webinar. This webinar introduces Alberta's health and safety requirements related to workplace violence and harassment. If you have any questions about occupational health and safety, call the Alberta OHS Contact Center at 1-866-415-8690. If you're in Edmonton or the surrounding area, you can call the Contact Center at 780-415-8690. After watching this webinar, please take a moment to fill out a short survey and give us your feedback. The link to the survey is on the YouTube page below the subscribe button. Before we begin, we have a disclaimer and copyright notice to bring to your attention. We've done our best to ensure that the information in this webinar is accurate and up to date. However, if there's any discrepancy between what we present here and the requirements in the OHS laws, the law is considered correct. Please pause the video to read this statement. We've split the information in this webinar into two main sections. In the first, we'll look at where you can find key OHS legal requirements for violence and harassment prevention, the OHS Act's definitions of violence and harassment, and employer, supervisor, and worker general duties related to violence and harassment prevention. We'll also introduce some key technical requirements related to violence and harassment. These include hazard assessment and control, violence and harassment prevention plans, worker training, requirements for investigating violence and harassment incidents or complaints and supporting workers, and industry-specific requirements for retail fueling outlets and convenience stores. As we go through this webinar, feel free to pause the video or go back at any time if you need a moment to review the information. Let's start by looking at some introductory content related to violence and harassment prevention requirements. This is an overview of where key requirements related to violence and harassment are found in Alberta's OHS laws. The OHS Act defines violence and harassment. It also includes general duties for worksite parties such as employers, supervisors, and workers. Some of these general duties are specifically related to preventing violence and harassment. Detailed requirements for preventing violence and harassment are set out in Part 27 of the OHS Code. It's also important to know that violence and harassment are a workplace hazard. As such, they must be addressed under Part 2 of the OHS Code, which sets out hazard assessment, elimination, and control requirements. Learning the laws about workplace violence and harassment is only a start. It's important that you know the rest of the OHS laws that apply to your work and your worksite. You can consult these laws directly by visiting alberta.ca/OHS-Act-Regulation-Code. There, you can access the OHS Act, Regulation, and Code, download free PDFs of the legislation, order print copies, or learn about updates to the laws. There's also a link to the government's online searchable legislation tool on this page. That tool lets you quickly access, print, and share individual sections of OHS legislation that are relevant to you, your work, and your worksite, including, of course, requirements related to violence and harassment. So, with that in mind, let's turn now to the OHS Act's definition of violence. As shown here, Section 1 of the OHS Act defines violence as the threatened, attempted, or actual conduct of a person that causes or is likely to cause physical or psychological injury or harm. Domestic or sexual violence is included in this definition of violence. Here are some examples of violence. Physical attack or aggression. Examples include hitting, shoving, pushing, or kicking a worker, throwing an object at a worker, or kicking an object the worker is standing on, such as a ladder. Threatening behavior, such as shaking a fist in a worker's face or wielding a weapon at work. Verbal or written threats, including leaving threatening notes or sending threatening emails. And sexual or domestic violence, which we'll look at next. Sexual violence as a workplace hazard includes any sexual act or attempt to obtain a sexual act by any person, regardless of their relationship to the victim, whether at the worksite or work-related. Sexual violence ranges from obscene name-calling to physical acts and includes online sexual violence and exploitation. Domestic violence is a pattern of behavior used by one person to gain power and control over another with whom a person has or has had a personal relationship. This can range from subtle coercive forms of violence to acts that result in physical harm or death. Examples of such behavior may include physical violence, sexual abuse, financial control, emotional and psychological intimidation, verbal abuse, stalking, and using electronic devices to harass and control. Domestic violence can occur between, but isn't limited to, current or former intimate partners, people of all ages, family members, people of all racial, economic, educational, and religious backgrounds, and people in heterosexual, same-gender, or non-binary relationships. The nature of the relationships could be living together or separately, married or unmarried, or in short or long-term relationships. Domestic violence becomes a workplace hazard and is no longer limited to a personal issue when it occurs or spills over into the workplace. It may put the targeted worker at risk and may pose a threat to coworkers. Section 390.3 of the OHS Code reinforces that domestic violence can be a workplace hazard and that employers must take reasonable precautions to protect their workers and other people at the worksite when this is the case. Having looked at the definition of violence, let's now move on to harassment. Like violence, harassment is a workplace hazard. It's also a complex issue. In very general terms, you can think of harassment as objectionable or unwelcome conduct, comment, bullying, or action by someone who knows or should know that it will cause harm. However, the legal definition is more detailed and precise. The first part of the definition is shown here. Please pause the video to read this slide. The second part of the OHS Act's definition of harassment lists a broad range of behaviors that could involve or affect workers. According to the Act, harassment includes conduct, comments, bullying, or actions because of race, religious beliefs, color, physical disability, mental disability, age, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, and a sexual solicitation or advance. Here are some examples of behaviors that fall under the Act's list of what constitutes harassment. Any type of discrimination is harassment. Harassment can also be unwelcome conduct, comments, gestures, or contact, such as name-calling, harassing phone calls, spreading rumors, displaying or circulating offensive material in any format, including print or digital, or deliberate misgendering, which is intentionally using terms or pronouns that don't align with a person's affirmed gender. An example of this would be referring to someone who identifies as they/them, using pronouns such as he or she. As well, bullying or intimidating behaviors that create fear or mistrust, such as fist shaking or yelling, standing too close to someone, making inappropriate gestures or comments, or posting or sending offensive or intimidating messages through social media or email are all examples of harassment. Workplace harassment can also include behaviors such as excluding or isolating a worker, making unreasonable demands that set a worker up to fail, intentionally withholding information from a worker or giving false information to a worker, taking away work or responsibility without cause, or sexual solicitation or advances. Having looked at what workplace harassment is, let's move on to the last part of the definition of harassment. As shown here, the OHS Act's definition of harassment states that reasonable actions taken by an employer or supervisor while managing and directing workers are not considered harassment. Examples of reasonable actions that an employer or supervisor can take include changing work assignments, scheduling, assessing, and evaluating work performance, inspecting workplaces, implementing health and safety measures, or taking disciplinary action with just cause. Differences of opinion or minor disagreements between coworkers are also not generally considered to be workplace harassment, but can turn into harassment if they're not resolved. Likewise, difficult conditions of employment, such as professional practice limitations, organizational changes, or financial restrictions, are not considered harassment. Work-related stress on its own isn't harassment. However, an accumulation of stress factors resulting from harassing behaviors, such as those described earlier, can result in a harassment situation. We've covered a lot of information so far. If you don't feel clear about the definitions of violence or harassment, please feel free to pause this video and review that content again. Otherwise, we'll finish the Getting Started section of this webinar with a look at general duties. Regulated worksite parties are defined in the OHS Act. All regulated worksite parties have legal responsibilities. These include general duties under Part 2 of the Act. Occupational health and safety laws are based on the concept of the internal responsibility system. The internal responsibility system is a way of sharing responsibility for health and safety among everyone in the workplace. Responsibility is shared according to each person's legal obligations, which are often based on a person's authority and control at the worksite. Because control and authority may not be shared equally at the workplace, responsibilities may not be shared equally. The internal responsibility system is reflected in the OHS Act's general obligations, including employer, supervisor, and worker duties related to violence and harassment prevention. Section 3 of the OHS Act sets out general duties for employers. These include that employers must ensure that their workers aren't subjected to and don't participate in violence or harassment at the worksite. Supervisor general duties are stated in Section 4 of the OHS Act. They include that supervisors must take all precautions necessary to ensure workers under their supervision aren't subjected to and don't participate in violence or harassment at the worksite. And under Section 5 of the OHS Act, workers have a general duty to refrain from causing or participating in harassment or violence. Before we move on, it's also important to note that all regulated parties, including employers, supervisors, and workers, have a common general duty to cooperate with anyone exercising a duty under the OHS Act, regulation, or code. This duty to cooperate is critical in achieving many health and safety goals, including in relation to complex issues like violence and harassment prevention. That wraps up the first section of this webinar. Now, let's move on to look at key OHS code requirements for violence and harassment prevention. Part 2 of the OHS code contains requirements related to hazard assessment, elimination, and control. Employers must conduct hazard assessments and must eliminate each identified hazard if it's reasonably practicable to do so. If it's not reasonably practicable to eliminate a hazard, employers must put controls in place to protect workers. Violence and harassment are workplace hazards, and as such, they must be addressed as per the requirements in Part 2 of the Code. The hazard assessment requirements in Part 2 provide a consistent approach for employers and workers to identify and control hazards in the workplace. A consistent approach includes following the hierarchy of controls pictured on this slide and required in Part 2 of the Code. There are many ways to do a hazard assessment. The Government of Alberta has several resources that can help employers develop a systematic hazard assessment process. A handbook with templates and a step-by-step example of the hazard assessment process, a webinar like this one on the topic of hazard assessment, and an interactive e-learning resource. Each of these resources can be accessed on the government's OHS resource portal. The URLs are shown here. Please pause the video if you'd like to write any of them down. Employers must ensure their hazard assessment process is specific to their worksite and meets all the requirements of Part 2 of Alberta's OHS Code. As a reminder, this URL will take you to the OHS Act, Regulation, and Code, as well as the government's searchable legislation tool, so that you can consult the Part 2 requirements directly. Now let's move on to the last main subsection in this webinar, an introduction to Part 27 of the OHS Code. Part 27 sets out specific requirements for violence and harassment prevention. These include the rules that an employer must follow in relation to violence and harassment prevention plans, training workers in violence and harassment prevention, investigating incidents of violence or harassment, supporting a worker affected by violence or harassment at the employer's worksite, and additional rules that apply specifically to fuel and convenience stores. One Part 27 requirement for all employers is to develop and implement a violence and harassment prevention plan. Part 27 also sets out the minimum requirements for what must be included in the plan, when the plan must be reviewed and revised, and worker consultation in relation to the plan's development, implementation, and review. Let's look at each of these. Violence and harassment prevention plans must include these elements: measures to eliminate, or if that isn't reasonably practicable, to control violence and harassment hazards, procedures to inform workers about the nature and extent of violence and harassment hazards, including specific or general threats, reporting procedures for violence or harassment, and investigation procedures for violence or harassment complaints and incidents. Violence and harassment plans must also include provisions to protect the confidentiality of worksite parties involved in a complaint or incident, except where disclosure is required by law or is necessary to investigate the complaint or incident, take corrective action, inform involved parties about investigation results or corrective action, or inform workers of a specific or general threat of violence or potential violence. A violence and harassment prevention plan must be in writing. It can be on paper or in digital format, but either way, it must be readily available for reference by workers and the Health and Safety Committee or representative if there is one. Employers are normally required to review the plan at least every 3 years. However, the employer must review the plan sooner than 3 years if there's been an incident of harassment or violence that indicates a review is needed, if there's been a change in work or the worksite that could affect the potential for violence or harassment, or if the Health and Safety Committee or representative requests a review. Reviews should focus on whether the prevention plan is current and whether there are any gaps that need to be addressed. As a result of the review, the plan may or may not need to be revised. Employers must revise the plan if a required review indicates that's necessary. Employers must consult the Health and Safety Committee or representative if there is one when developing, implementing, and reviewing the Violence and Harassment Prevention Plan. If there isn't a Health and Safety Committee or representative, the employer must consult affected workers as far as is reasonably practicable. Employers have an obligation under OHS law to ensure workers are adequately trained in all matters necessary to protect their health and safety. This includes violence and harassment prevention training. As set out in Section 391 of the OHS Code, the employer must ensure that the workers are trained in recognizing violence and harassment as hazards, the employer's violence and harassment plan, including any revisions, the appropriate response to violence and harassment, including how to get help, and the procedures for reporting, investigating, and documenting violence and harassment complaints or incidents. Certain requirements apply to violence and harassment incident investigations. When an incident of violence or harassment occurs, a prime contractor must carry out an investigation. If there is no prime contractor, this responsibility falls to the employer. The prime contractor or employer must prepare an investigation report that outlines the circumstances of the incident and any actions taken to prevent recurrence, and must keep the report for at least 2 years after the incident. The report must also be readily available to an OHS officer who requests a copy. Employers must also provide workers with specific supports in relation to incidents of violence or harassment at their worksite. To start with, the employer must ensure that a worker reporting an injury or adverse symptom from an incident is advised to consult a healthcare professional of the worker's choice for treatment or referral. As well, if a worker is treated or referred by a physician in relation to the incident, and the treatment occurs during regular work hours, the employer must consider the worker to be at work during the treatment. Part 27 includes some violence and harassment requirements that apply specifically to retail fueling outlets and convenience stores. Some of these requirements are for specific elements that fuel or convenience store employers must include in their violence and harassment prevention plan. When working alone, workers at fuel and convenience stores must wear a personal emergency transmitter that their employer provides and monitors, and customers at retail fueling outlets must prepay for fuel. Here are links to some Government of Alberta resources designed to help employers comply with the fuel and convenience store requirements in Part 27 of the Code. They include a guide to help fuel or convenience store employers develop violence and harassment prevention plans with a special focus on industry-specific requirements, a resource to help employers choose options for complying with the fuel prepay requirement, and stickers and decals that can be used to inform the public about the fuel prepay requirement and deter crime by indicating that there is limited cash on hand and video surveillance is in use. Again, each of these resources can be accessed on the government's OHS resource portal. Please pause the video if you want to write any of the URLs down. We've come to the end of our introduction to the violence and harassment prevention requirements in Alberta's occupational health and safety laws. In addition to the Government of Alberta's OHS Act, Regulation and Code webpage, you can visit the other two URLs shown here to review much of the information we've covered in this webinar and find links to related resources. Thank you for watching this webinar. If you have questions about workplace violence or harassment requirements or anything else regarding occupational health and safety, call the OHS Contact Center at 1-866-415-8690. And again, to help us improve our webinars, please fill out a short survey and give us your feedback. The link to the survey is in the description on the YouTube page below the subscribe button.